and gentlemen, welcome to Man in America. I'm your host, Seth Holhouse. So I'm very excited because this is part one of a two-part interview with Corey Lynn, who perhaps you're familiar with. She has the very, very phenomenal website, corysdigs.com, and she is one of the best investigative journalists that I've come across that's actually working to investigate the truth, not being weaponized against we, the people. So in the first part of this interview, we're going to be diving into what is, I think, a very important topic, and it's looking at how the elites or the cabal has structured the global system, their corporations, their nonprofits, the banks, everything, how they've structured this whole infrastructure in a way that gives them immunity and privileges that almost no one has access to. How is it that, for instance, someone from the UN becomes basically has legal immunity here in the United States? How have they managed to assemble this infrastructure that doesn't allow governments to go after them? And so, as we look around, especially look at what happened these past couple of years with COVID, you have to ask yourself, like, how are they not getting in trouble? How can we not go after this? Well, this discussion will answer a lot of those questions. And then in part two, which will be coming out in a couple of days after this interview, we're going to be extending this conversation into a discussion about outer space and actually how this infrastructure extends into outer space. And so that's going to be a wild interview as well. But let's go ahead and dive into this first one, the first part. As you probably can tell, if you're watching this on Rumble, this is going to be an audio only interview. That's just how Corey does her interviews. So this will be an audio only interview. So folks, please enjoy this interview with Corey Lynn. Corey, it's so wonderful to have you on the show. I've read so much of your work, but it's my first time actually speaking to you and interviewing you. And it's great to have you here.
Well, it's great to be here. I appreciate you having me, and I have a lot of respect for your work as well.
Well, thank you. So your website, Corey's Digs, is what I think a lot of folks are probably familiar with. But can you just give us just a brief background of yourself? Because you're someone that is a highly skilled investigative journalist, but you're not writing for a big media or something like that. You're publishing on your own website like information that could be books. So how'd you even get into doing this?
Well, I've been, we'll say I've been spiritually guided here for many years. And in 2016 is when I started seeing things, kick off. And I knew that I needed to start digging and putting information together to show big picture agendas against humanity. I honestly didn't want to dive into this. I never was involved in politics. I avoided, the dark negative stuff. I flowed through life pretty nicely. But I felt an obligation to, I don't like people being taken advantage of or manipulated. It really upsets me. And I started, I could start uncovering and digging, and I always connect a million dots in my head and see the big picture. And so I wanted to start coming at, most of the majority of my reports are agendas against all of humanity. It doesn't matter whether you're left or right or, so I didn't get into the politics end of it a whole lot. Most of it is just focused on these huge agendas to basically control us and depopulate us. And it's become this, it's a spiritual battle, but it's also a physical battle, psychological, psychic, all of it, all at once. We're just being hammered. So I decided I needed to put together a website and start actually publishing what I was looking into. And it just kind of snowballed from there. And then I got connected with the Sharp Edge and the Speaker, and we started doing the Dig It podcast weekly. So I I prefer to always remain anonymous. It's not about me. It's not about my face. I have no desire for fame or to be the center of attention. I just want to get the information out. So that's why I've always just kind of, I collaborate with a lot of wonderful journalists and people, and I share their work too. But I just prefer to kind of go it on my own.
Well, it's important because you mentioned kind of fighting in this war, and I mean, it's an information war, and the I'd say the lack of this kind of understanding is what has led a lot of people to walk into so many of these traps of the globalists because they just don't have this information, which is why, I mean, and that's why I started doing this as well, because I thought, well, people need more information. And I think more and more so now we've realized that the mainstream media is not just, corrupt or greedy or whatever you want to call it. They're actually complicit. They are weapons pointed at us, and they're weapons being used to enslave us and to get us to fight each other, and but also to hide the real truth that you're uncovering. And so, this is going to be a two-part interview. So we'll publish the second part shortly after this one. But so we're going to be first looking at one of the big questions that I have, which is why is it these giant organizations can never be brought to justice? And then we'll be diving into some the second half of this show. We'll be looking at basically off grid, off planet infrastructure and how that ties into so many important things that we're going to be covering. So let's just go ahead and jump into this first one here. And you have a series, a three-part series called "Laundering with Immunity," and I find that you really help paint the picture as to how complex the layers and layers of immunities are that they've created for themselves. So why don't you just start wherever you want to start with on that topic, because it's such an important one.
Yeah, it's really the core of the infrastructure of how they've been able to get away with this for so long and literally operate outside the law entirely. And so this dates back to 1945, uh, and the creation of the UN. But then there's also the OAS, which is the Organization of American States that very few people know about. And they started working on implementing their group back in 1826, which came to fruition in 1890. And so they actually preceded the UN, and they cover the Western Hemisphere. They operate it's kind of like a smaller version of the UN. So they cover, Latin America and the Caribbean, Mexico, Canada, and the US. And so how the UN has the WHO, whereas OAS has PAHO. And so the WHO's regional office is in PAHO's office for the Western Hemisphere. And so what we have is, and I'm going to give you some dates, and I'm going to pull these up because I don't have all of these dates memorized, but this is really key. Because we have, going back to 1913, we have the creation of the Federal Reserve. And then in 1930, the Bank for International Settlements was founded, which I'm just going to refer to as BIS from here on out. And then in 1944, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which is the World Bank, that was founded. So if we look at October 24th, 1945, you have Rep. Robert Doughton, who was friends with Truman. He introduced the International Organizations Immunities Act to Congress. So coincidentally, that's the same day the UN officially began operating. And then 2 months later, December 27th, 1945, 11 European countries signed the International Bank. We're just going to call it the World Bank because that's what it is. So they signed the Articles of Agreement. 2 days later, on December 29th, the US signed the International Organization Immunities Act into law. So basically, they formed the UN right? This is all under the guise of peacekeeping and after World War II, and now we have to immediately implement these privileges and immunities, which I'll get into, in order to make it so that they can do their work a little easier, more convenient, without headache, and be a little more free to roam. And so this passed through Congress, and what happens is the presidents, by executive order, can designate an international organization with these privileges and immunities. And so, of course, Truman kicked this off on February 19th, 1946. He began dishing out immunities, which, of course, included, the first ones to get it was the UN and World Bank and the OAS. Now, if we fast forward, and I'm just going to skip real quick because this is a key date for people to realize. So September 1994 is when the BIS board, the first BIS board meeting happened after the Federal Reserve finally purchased shares into the BIS system. This is what kicked off the central bank system on a global scale. So we have multiple things going on here. We have the Bank for International Settlements, which has 63 central banks, and they also have, the insurers underneath them. They have immunities and privileges. And when banks are operating and doing functions, with BIS, that extends based on the language on their own site and their own documents, those immunities would extend to them. So keeping that in mind, now you take the treaties. There's multiple layers to this. So now you take the treaties, because BIS, the UN, and OAS are your three top dogs as far as the level, the amount of immunities and privileges they have. And they have, through treaties. So you've got treaties, you have headquarters agreements, and it's just layers and layers of protection. So with the International Organizations Immunities Act, whereas that was passed in 1945 in the US, everyone needs to look up in their countries. If you just do a search for those keywords, sometimes they'll flip it and they'll say privileges and immunities versus immunities and privileges. First off, all 193 states, through the UN treaty, they have the immunities. But you're going to find in dozens and dozens of countries, they have an overlap of many of these organizations. So we gave out 76 organizations, 22 of which are the UN. And then there's, I don't remember the exact number. It's like 5 or 6 arms of the OAS. And then the rest is a mixture. And we could list some of those off as we go over this. But all of these were given these immunities and privileges throughout time through various presidents, all the way up until you got to President Trump. So President Trump and President Biden, if we want to call him president, have not given out, designated this to any international organizations. So, and I'll go over what those immunities and privileges look like, what those are. But I just want to make it very clear that I was covering the US, and whereas I do get into some crossover with Geneva, such as the WEF, who got immunities from the Host Act in Switzerland, but not in the US. So what you're going to find is, if you start, and I would love to do a giant map on this, Seth. I would love to have all the countries and go, okay, these dozen organizations overlap in every country. These dozen are in half of them. And so my point is, they built this massive network, this global web, where these people are walking around with total immunities and privileges. And I can pause if you haven't want to interject anything here before I go into what those privileges and immunities are.
Yeah. So I'm wrapping my head around this. And so if I understand correctly, so we have the BIS, the Bank of International Settlements, which is from my understanding, is that kind of like the structure that contains or that kind of runs the central banks around the world.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, they're like at the top of the pyramid. I actually
Okay.
have a pyramid in my report that kind of shows how this all trickles down.
Okay. So you have you mentioned these three, the BIS, the United Nations, and the OAS, the Organization of American States, and
And of course, the central banks.
in the
Yes.
central banks. Okay. So basically, so this is very interesting because, one of the constant questions I'm asking or I'm digging into is how is our world being run? Right? Because if you look at with COVID, for an example, it's like, how is it that this same kind of set of principles and language and safe and effective and all the different aspects of 2 weeks to stop the spread, it was this global campaign that was organized. It was just as organized as if, let's just say there was a global fashion brand like Prada, say they were launching a new product, right? And you saw in every store around the world they had the new purse, the new color, the new leather, whatever it is. You would say, "Oh, that's obviously being centrally organized. There's an office in Milan, and they've got their marketing team there, and it would make sense." But when you look at something like COVID, which it involved the media in every country, the governments, the school systems, the banks, the funding, the big techs, and everything, you say, "Gosh, that was orchestrated in such a centrally commanded way." It wasn't just that all these countries, kind of helped each other and worked together to fight this great pandemic. And so the question, really comes to me is like, well, who's organizing that? Is it like, Jacob de Rothschild sitting in some lair, barking out orders that get carried out? And so this is helpful though, because I think what you've done is you're breaking down what you call the control framework, but what's also so important is it's how that control framework has what you refer to as these privileges and immunities. Like, how is it that, Bill Gates with Gavi, for instance, they're not paying taxes on all these things. They're not being held accountable for, crimes against humanity in Africa. All this stuff. So like what you're putting together, it makes it all make sense.
Yeah. Yeah. It's quite staggering. And I would say that the WEF, the World Economic Forum, I look at more as the strategists and the marketing. They're the ones who, get together and they strategize and they come up with the plans and they come up with the budgets and they tell everyone how to move money and move stuff. And then you've got the UN arm and they're moving money through these central banks. And so, as an example, just all the money that's gone to Ukraine when the Republicans are saying, well, we're demanding that we want a breakdown of, we want proof of where this money's gone and where it's been spent. Well, so I'm looking into this and I'm going, well, half of this is being funneled through the World Bank, who has privileges and immunities. So you're never going to get it out of them. And the other half is going through the DOD and everything's redacted and they won't even show, under foreign aid. When you look that up, everything's just redacted. They won't even show where it's going. So, we'll see this time and time again. And what's really concerning is with the UN and the Organization of American States, they have in their treaties, they are the only ones, with the exception of BIS.
Hey, folks, I've got a quick message for you. So, I'm sure you've heard a lot of people, myself included, talking about the importance of buying precious metals, gold and silver. But what's really behind that? Is just a thing of, hey, buy this gold, buy this silver, right? Or is there something deeper that we should be looking at? So I recently came across some figures about house prices. So in 1930, the average family home was approximately $4,000. Fast forward to 2023, the average family home is just over $400,000. So you have to ask yourself, why is that? Is it because things have just gotten more expensive? No, it's actually because the dollar has lost 99% of its value since 1930, right? When people talk about the collapse of the dollar or inflation, this is what it means. Now, let's take a look at gold. So in 1930, if you wanted to purchase your home in gold, it would take approximately 200 gold coins. So 200 gold coins would purchase the average family home in 1930, about $4,000. Now, if you, instead of buying a home with that gold or cash, you set those aside, if you set aside $4,000 in cash in 1930, it would be worth $4,000 today. What can you buy with $4,000? Can you buy a family home? No, you can't even buy a crappy used car. But if you set aside $4,000 worth of gold coins in 1930, which is 200 gold coins, 1-ounce coins, that would be worth approximately $400,000 today. And this is the key lesson about precious metals. It's not about getting rich. It's about putting your money into an asset that protects you against inflation and against the destruction of the currency, which is what happens to all fiat currencies, especially now we're in the end days of the dollar. And so that's why it's important, maybe not all of your money, but a portion of your money, a portion of what you have, I highly recommend putting it into precious metals of gold and silver, because what it's doing is it's protecting you. This is an asset that has stood the test of time, not just stood the test of time since the 1930s. We're talking about the rise and fall of civilizations. Gold was used to buy houses back in ancient Rome. It's still around. It's an asset that will forever have its value. So folks, if you want to do this and you need someone that you can trust, there's no person I can recommend more than Dr. Kirk Elliott. He's a very good friend of mine. He's a strong Christian patriot, and he's out to really help people to protect their savings and what you've worked for against the destruction of the dollar, not to mention also protecting it against the dangers of central bank digital currencies. So to learn more about this, go to goldwithseth.com or call 720-605-3900. Again, that's goldwithseth.com or 720-605-3900. Both those places will allow you to set up a quick appointment where you can talk to a wealth advisor that will help get you started on this path. Again, goldwithseth.com, 720-605-3900.
To where it can the immunities can extend to those that are working with them and through them. So now you start looking at the hundreds of NGOs, right? Like the Clinton Foundation, for example. And you look at the work they've done, which is always in conjunction with the UN, or an arm of the UN. I mean, they've got like 22 arms. And there you go. So we've got, under the Organization of American States, they've done work with Facebooks. They get involved with elections. Microsoft, they get involved with all of them. And then they have these NDAs. So the documents are all inviolable. The finances are inviolable. And with their headquarters agreements, let me just read you. Hang on. This applies to both the UN and OAS. It's the same language in both. If you just interchange those. No federal, state, or local officer or official of the United States, whether administrative, judicial, military, or police, may enter UN headquarters except with the consent of and under conditions agreed to by the Secretary General of the organization. Same thing goes with OAS, who's located right, a block from the White House. And so the individual privileges, let me just break those down so people understand what we're talking about, what level, what this level of protection means. So I'm going to read these bullet points. The international organizations, their property and their assets, wherever located and by whomsoever held, shall enjoy the same immunity from suit and every form of judicial process as is enjoyed by foreign governments, unless the organization waives their immunity, which they don't do. Because I've tracked them and I've not seen them in any case waive their immunity. That would be foolish of them. So we have immunity from search and seizure of property and assets wherever located and by whomsoever held. All archives are inviolable. They have exemption from property taxes, internal revenue taxes, communications taxes, taxes on transportation of persons or property, custom duties. admission of officers and employees and their family members without checks from customs. Officers and employees are exempt from legal suits or any other legal action in regards to activities related to work. Employees are exempt from income tax if they are not U.S. citizens or are both a U.S. citizen and a citizen of the Commonwealth of the Philippines. Officers and employees of these international organizations and members of their immediate families, other than nationals of the United States, require no alien registration or fingerprinting or registration of foreign assets. I mean, it's pretty crazy, right? So we wonder.
It is. Well, I'll just ask. So basically, I mean, it's not just, okay, you can't sue the UN. I mean, it's crazy that even the employees get these immunities. These are immunities that no Americans get. These are privileges that no Americans get. I mean, unless you're some high level diplomat. And so basically,
it's actually equivalent. It's the same privileges a diplomat gets. It actually states that in their language.
And so
it's crazy.
With kind of working through. Let me put out a scenario, because that's how it's helpful for me to understand these things. Let's just imagine that the UN, right, it's the United Nations, hypothetically. Let's just imagine that the UN itself thought that something happening in America was not in accordance with a globalist agenda, and say they blew up a rally, hypothetically, right? That was something that was very, like, obviously they crossed a line, and it would be treated as a terrorist activity. Say they killed many people that they didn't like and whatnot. So basically, with this immunity, what it would mean is that the CIA, which would technically be like the international kind of crime force to investigate that, or whoever it would be, they can't even step into the offices of the UN. They can't go look at their files. They can't even get a warrant, right, unless it's granted by the UN, right? So is that basically that? That's what this immunity is. It basically means that these organizations can commit any crime and they cannot be prosecuted.
Well, what they will say is, the way their language reads, is if it has anything to do with the work that they're doing for the organization itself. So if one of their employees, for example, goes out on the street and, shoots someone dead, that has nothing really to do with work. So one would like to believe they could be prosecuted. But anything that happens with work that they're doing, they hold these internal, almost like internal courts in a way, and they handle things internally, and they do their own audits, and and they don't pay taxes. So I think we've seen a lot of stuff get swept under the rug, and which has extended to a lot of NGOs and Bill Gates. So the Global Fund, of course, is one of the organizations, one of the 76 organizations, and that's through the International Organizations Immunities Act in the US. I guarantee you it's in other countries, they've get granted the same immunities. And then, of course, in Switzerland. And then, of course, you have Gavi as well. So there's two right there that were very involved with rolling out the jabs for COVID. All these organizations, you start... Let me just read a handful so that people can put this in perspective, because in addition to the UN and the OAS, we have other organizations that when I'm looking at this, I'm going, well, there's the whole future infrastructure. I mean, they've got it all covered. They've got, the labor organization. They've got all arms of the bank, and then the central banks. We've got the International Telecommunications Union, which coincidentally is now under the UN. Let me get past some of the UN ones. We have the International Cotton Advisory Committee, the International Joint Commission, United States and Canada. We have several that have to do with the borders of the US and Mexico. The Pacific Community, the OECD, they're a big one, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. They have immunities. Inter-American Defense Board, International Organization for Migration, huge one. IOM, we're seeing them all over right now with everyone covering the border. The Universal Postal Union, Atomic, well, that's under the UN, the International Atomic Energy Agency. I mean, they have so many arms. The let's see here, Maritime Organization. I'm just reading through these. We have fish. We have the Tropical Tuna Commission, the Halibut Commission, the Great Lakes Fishery Commission. So now we're talking about, the fishing, and they're coming after that industry as well. And then we even have a handful of banks in here that are separate from the central bank, such as the Asian Development Bank, the Inter-American Investment Corporation, the European Bank for Construction and Development. We've got the European Space Agency. I mean, so you start going through this, World Trade Organization, African Union, International Mobile Satellite Organization. So they've got like all the industries covered here. And it's just been this massive infrastructure operating right under our noses all this time, and they can't be held accountable. And they state that in order to remove these, that the Secretary of State determines that if the Secretary of State determines that the continued presence of a person from an international organization in the United States is no longer desirable, or if the Secretary of State wishes to withdraw the privileges, exemptions, and immunities of the organization itself, they have the power to do so. Well, my question is, can't Congress go in and say, you know what? We're done with the International Organizations Immunities Act because it's all being used for corruption and to launder money.
Hey, folks, I have a quick message for you. Thank you so much for watching, listening to this interview. I have one small request. If you're enjoying what you're listening to, could you please share this interview with one person, just one person? Because of censorship and shadow banning, it's so hard to get this content out to more people. And the only way we can really do it is when you help by sharing it. So if you like what you're listening to, hit pause, share it with one person. It helps so much. Thank you so much.
I don't know. I've been trying to ask this question to people for a year now. Can't we stop this? Because if you take away these privileges and immunities, that's like game on,
Is that something that can be done at the presidential level? Like, let's just say hypothetically Trump is back in 2025 and he starts making changes, like we saw that he pulled us out of the WHO or stopped funding. I think he cut off funding the WHO, if I remember correctly. So I guess it seems like this control framework has the foundation for this has been laid over, literally over a century in the making to give them this global control. And I want to talk in a minute here about what is the end goal for that. But considering the complexity of what it has taken to put it in place, how can it be dismantled? Because I'm guessing that it's something we, the people, can't touch.
Right. I would think, and I'm not positive on this, but I would think an executive order could be revoked by a president. I mean, if they're the ones who can, do this by executive order, and I have all the executive orders listed in my report and the exact dates of when each of these organizations, were founded and then received these privileges. And there were a few where they went in and made, the next president came in and maybe he added a little adjustment to one of them. So that is a possibility, I think. Possibly. I don't know. But right now, in the situation we're in, I got to believe Congress could do something to act on this.
Yeah, we've got a lot of faith in Congress.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, it's pretty much a uniparty out there. There's just like a handful of really good ones, and the rest is kind of a shit show.
It is. And so I want to talk about what the end goal of this looks like, what this framework gets them into, what it accomplishes. But then also, I want to talk about the potential weaknesses and whether they actually have the amount of control that it seems they do. But kind of in the first part of that question, where do you see as what do you see being the end game of this centuries of groundwork and these international companies, and we'll get into the technology heavy in the next discussion, but where's this headed? What do they want to do with this framework?
So I think it's a complex, multi-layer thing going on, because I do feel like there are sort of different factions working together. They all have somewhat of common goals, but different approaches and maybe slightly different goals in some areas. But I would say the overall one that they all seem to be in agreement on is they want to move into a digital currency, digital IDs, AI, you know, we could say transhumanism. There's a socialist agenda to remove gender altogether. Um, there's so many agendas coming at us at once, but if they can control us through digital ID and through our finances, then they therefore can control our access and our spending and build out a social credit system, which we're already seeing. They don't, I've read so many white papers, Seth, like they don't hide this. They just don't make it they don't put it in your face so much, but it's not hidden at all. So people can find any of this. So they want this, ultimate control grid, and they want to remove everyone's identity. They don't want you to think for yourself. That's quite clear. They want to raise, I did a 9-part series on the education system and social emotional learning, which actually gets into a whole like religious, spiritual type sense that's really not religious or spiritual. It looks a little more on the satanic end. And they want to build out this whole workforce of children and start incorporating start basically at birth. They want from cradle to grave. They want the digital identity in place, the full control over your thoughts, over all narratives. They don't want people going against the narrative, that's for sure. We've seen plenty of that. And so, yeah, like in part 2, when we get into the other one, we kind of get more in depth into that end of it. But ultimately, if they can control your finances and track everything you do, which they can already track us quite well, then that's not good. And of course, I do believe depopulation factors into that. It's too hard to control 8 billion people. So
No, it's hard to control like my 3-year-old daughter, let alone a planet full of people. And I mean, it's frightening. I've covered a lot about communist China and the level of control their technology gives them, and it's like something out of a Mad Max dystopian movie. Right? It's terrible, but
and we definitely want to replicate that. So in China, just to give you a few stats, in China, the QR code payments reached 1.3 trillion US dollars in the fourth quarter of 2019. And we want that QR code, rolled out everywhere over here. And they're using the banks to push this, to drive this agenda. And so, and of course, smartphones are the weapon of choice, and they have everyone engaged in social media and PayPal and Venmo and debit cards and getting rid of cash. And it's wild. They've got 6.4 billion mobile phone users already. And their goal is to have 7.7 billion. This is what's expected actually by 2028, utilizing cell phones. And that is the tracking. That is where you swipe your QR code. That holds your identity, to your access to banking. For now. In the future, I think that's going to change. I think something's going to be more, a part of our body, so that a cell phone isn't really necessary, because if you ditched it, then you're not really in the system.
Folks, I have a quick message for you. Look, the 2024 election is do or die for the globalists and communists that have infiltrated our country and are currently running it. And they either have to win or they're going to destroy America, so nothing is left either way. And if you're the person that's watching this show and following this information, unfortunately, you have the weight on your shoulders of making sure that your family is prepared, especially as we head into this next year and this next election cycle, because unfortunately, I think it's going to get rough. And one of the ways I know they're going to target us is through our food supply. You can see all the food factories burned down. You can see the warnings of coming famines and food shortages and everything like that. And food is one of the number one ways totalitarian regimes have always used to control the population, is destroy the food supply. So if you don't have at least 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months worth of stored food, I highly recommend you take that very seriously, because look, as I mentioned, if you're the person that's watching this, you're the person that carries the burden of making sure your family is prepared. I would recommend at least 6 months, if not a year, of storable food. So if things go haywire, whether it's grid down or terrorist attack from what's coming across the border, that your family can safely stay in place and you can feed your family. So folks, today, go to heavensharvest.com and make sure you get your storable food that'll last for up to 25 years. Just in case things go south, you know that you have what's going to take to feed your family, which is so, so critical for us to get through this next stage of history. So go to heavensharvest.com today, order your food that'll last up to 25 years, and use promo code Seth to save 15% on your entire order. Again, that's heavensharvest.com and use promo code Seth, S-E-T-H, to save 15% on your entire order. And so looking at how currency and money is used as the central aspect of that control mechanism, which is true. I mean, everyone says, is kind of mocking Klaus Schwab of eat the bugs and everything, and say I'll never eat the bugs. But if you go to the local grocery store and you literally can't purchase anything except for bug food, and you don't have access to the local farm market because the farms have been since, kind of shut down or who knows what, then you may not have that choice, right? And that's the idea with this system. And so, and this is kind of looking more of a solution basis. What do you see as being the antidote to that?
Well, so there's a lot of, I'm just trying to think. There's a lot of different things. So I did 22 ways to stop vaccine ID passports, because that overlaps with the vaccine ID passports. Is the same thing as a digital ID, is the same thing as the QR code, or the real. It's called real ID, isn't it? A real, through the the driver's license facilities, how they're now rolling out the real ID. They want to bring in the biometrics and whatnot. So everyone needs to first stop using the darn QR codes. If you can ditch your smartphone, great. Limit. I did a whole piece on loosen technology's grip on your mind, and in that one, because all these little things add up. If you use cash, stop using credit cards. You're giving them a cut. Stop using debit cards. Just use cash. Ditch the smartphones, QR codes, share this information with everyone so people are aware of the bigger picture. I think that's half the battle. People need to learn to take a stand and just say no. When you go into a doctor's appointment and you get 4 pages of forms to fill out because you broke a toe, no, they don't need your whole family history. They don't need your social security number. People just willingly give over so much information. They just check off the agree to the terms and privacy without even reading it. And we know what that's done on the apps. Ditch your television, stop funding the beast, stop supporting the big box corps. Definitely find a local bank, community bank, credit union, some trusted bank that has good capital, that's trustworthy, and don't affiliate with the bigger central banks, because they're going to be the first to drive this through. So there's tons of like little things people can do. Just growing your own food, like every little thing we do to basically maintain our sovereignty and independence, and working with one another in more of a community fashion, that is going to have an impact against their agendas. And we've seen this in several cases, when people rise up against like Target, or, that are propagandizing everything and putting out all the stuff. I did like a 4-part in-depth report on the transgender agenda. That too, it's just it's coming at us from every angle, Seth.
It is.
So there's so many things people can do on an individual basis. And what I always say is, pray, meditate, visualize a positive future. Our thoughts have very much manifest our reality, and it's really important to stay positive. And it's sad, because you'll jump onto social media and it's so negative and it's so vile and there's so much hatred, and they're siphoning everyone's energy off by doing that. They're keeping everyone distracted and on this perpetual wheel, instead of focusing on their lives in the community, or on a state local level where they can actually make some changes and communicate with their representatives about starting a state bank and a gold and silver depository, and actually implementing, taking action, and rolling out plans. They have everyone distracted on a million things.
Yeah, it's silent weapons for quiet wars. You can just see it all playing out.
Yes.
in front of us. And so when it's difficult, because you mentioned the negativity, and it's something that I struggle with, and I'm sure that you do too, is I want to understand what they're doing. I want to understand their plans. If you're at war, you don't just want to ignore the fact that your enemy is building a giant warship off the coast that they're going to attack your city with in 6 months. It's good to know that, so you can move, you can build your own warship, you can sabotage their plans. I mean, there's a lot of courses of action you can take, but knowledge is power. But the struggle is that it is very dark. It's a very dystopian future. And I think there's certain people that they want to learn more about it, but then once they learn so much, they're like, I can't do it anymore. They become what they call black pilled, and they no longer, care anymore. It's all hopeless. And so it's a tough balance. But with this framework, with this infrastructure, which, as we've discussed, has been hundreds and hundreds of years of putting in place, and to get us towards this final plan, the fact that they keep, say, moving around, okay, is it Agenda 2021? Is it Agenda 2030? Now is it 2025? There's all these indicators that I see, at least, that their plan isn't quite going as they had hoped. But then also, when you look at the power of of information, and you look at the fact that, say, Epoch Times, for instance, which is now, I think, the 4th largest newspaper in America, like I spent many years working there, and I can tell I tell everyone, it's not a company that's owned by the cabal, right? It's completely independent of the control mechanism, and that's why they report fairly and honestly, and they've been a significant force and factor in helping people to see the truth. You look at Rumble, you look at the explosion of independent podcasts and media. So their control over people's minds and the narrative and what they would need to herd us into this digital prison, I think that control is weakening significantly as there is this, what they call the Great Awakening. But from your perspective, is there enough momentum, and is this awakening of people, is that something that can put a stop to this potential future totalitarian technocracy?
Yes, I believe so. And I believe two things. I think what you just said, um, I'm in total agreement with. I do believe that there are enough people awake to prevent some of these agendas from moving forward. I do think there will be some that go through, like the whole digital currency. I think they've they have so much infrastructure in place for that already, but I do think it's possible for states to withdraw from the Federal Reserve and create something within their own state. Um, the other thing is, I think that evil can't win because it self-destructs. So, for example, if some people will say this is karma, this is energy, or the truth always prevails. But if you keep pushing something that's not really supposed to go that way, and it's just totally working against the universal field, and then boom, all of a sudden you get into a car accident, or all of a sudden you fall down the stairs, or just that sort of wake up call, oh, this isn't working. I'm going to have to try a different avenue here. I feel like they're pushing so much that they are in desperate mode. They are trying to speed things up, and they are trying to push it out so hard and so fast in so many directions, to distract people. And we've seen a lot of things backfire on them. And I think that's going to continue. I think that they're going to literally self-destruct. I just don't think they can maintain, as this continues to amp up, I don't think they'll be able to maintain this pace. To us, it feels like it's moving really fast. To people unaware, it's like a slow roll, like all of a sudden they'll see this subtle little change in their bank account, and like they don't see everything snapping into place. But I do think that there will be a few things that will snap in, that will be, I think it's going to be a bumpy ride, Seth. I think it's going to be a bumpy ride, but I don't think they're going to win this battle to the point where they have this ultimate control grid and we can't go anywhere or do anything without their say so. I don't think we'll reach that point. I pray we don't.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. I really do. And there's a lot of ways or reasons why I've come to that conclusion. But I think that part of it is, and there's different ways you can look at this. You could say it's, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. Or, you mentioned karma, like what goes around comes around, right? Or, even looking at the yin yang, or the yin yang, right? I've studied a lot of Chinese philosophy, which is the idea that there's this balance of good and evil, but there's also cycles of the good being dominant and then the evil being dominant, and it comes and goes. But one thing that, with how that fits into, say, the more Western scientific perspective of every action having an equal and opposite reaction, is that when the black on that, say, rotating yin yang, that black, that darkness is expanding. It's expanding until it reaches the maximum point that it can expand. But at that point, it starts to contract. And so that is where I feel like that we're at in history. Like we've just passed that threshold, and now the evil is contracting, but the contraction of the evil is met with the growth of the good. And how I see it playing out also is that the more aggressively, the more overtly that the evil starts acting out of its frantic state, the more it actually accelerates that process of the black getting smaller and the white getting larger. And so, I mean, you can see, like, I think there's so many folks that I've talked to in person at speaking events, or, just commenting in chats and whatnot. And for them, COVID was the wake up call. COVID, which was supposed to be this very elaborate plan to lay the foundation for this digital prison and this prison system, prison planet. That was the thing that woke so many people up. And now these people are now resisting it. And now we're getting to a point where, as we're entering into the 2024 election, and you see that Trump is surging in polls, and there's all these videos going viral of some black rapper saying, like, I'm now pro Trump and I hate the Democrats. And you can see that everything's reversing. And that the more they push for some evil agenda, the more the more resistance comes back at them. And so I
Yep.
feel like that though it's extreme and they're very dangerous still, I do really wholeheartedly believe that we are witnessing the death of the cabal amidst this.
I agree. I agree. And this week in particular, I don't know. I felt just energetically some sort of shift that took place this week. So yeah, we're definitely on the same page with all of that.
So we can go ahead and wrap up. We're going to jump into part two of this discussion next, which will publish within a couple of days of this one. But on this particular topic, do you have any final thoughts you want to give the audience?
I would say start talking with your local state reps on nullifying the Federal Reserve and setting up state banks. I'm actually going to be putting some information out on this because Tennessee is kind of ahead of the game on this, working with some other states in potentially, hopefully, if everything stays on track, rolling out some really interesting stuff next year, having to do with the state banks and buying and selling gold and starting to create a monetary system within the states. So that would be phenomenal. And I will be, kind of covering this and getting information out on that and kind of working on the back end to see where this can go and hopefully build out a model that other states can follow or jump on board with. So, and from an individual standpoint, so connect with your reps or pay attention to this coming out and everything we already discussed really with the using cash. It frustrates me when I go into a store and I see everyone pull like just swiping their phone or pulling out their debit card, and I'm like, ugh, start using cash, people. So yeah, I would say, and you're right. It's very dark. It's very, look, when I'm doing these digs, one report could be 100 hours of research for me, and I'll get depressed. It's dark, heavy stuff. And then you have to balance and you have to step away and you have to go out in nature and you got to ground yourself, watch a comedy, spend time with friends and family. And you really got to just, almost switch your perspective, like perception rather. For me, it's like a light switch, I turn it on and off. Like I'm at work now, and then when I'm not, leave the phone to the side, enjoy my time with friends, try my hardest not to talk about any of this going on, though a lot of times people want to talk about it with me. So
That's true.
that part gets a little hard. But yeah, so I think balance is very key right now. Don't get sucked into their whole energy pull to get you amped up and agitated and angry and black pilled, and you have to have faith.
I couldn't agree more. And so, Corey, where can people find your work and how can people support what you're doing?
So they can find everything on coreysdigs.com. It's COREYSDIGS.com. And I have a weekly podcast I do with the Sharp Edge that comes out every Friday. You can find the links on my website as well. And yeah, I also have a ton of resources on there for diggers and, people who want to look stuff up. I have hundreds of resources and files, like unclassified documents as well. So it's a good resource site for people.
Great. I would also just encourage folks that are listening, if you know Corey's work or you go to the website and you find a lot of value in it, Corey does have a donation option on the website for either one time or monthly, or you can support her on Patreon. So I think that's also important because all the money is going not to the independent researchers and independent journalists and everything. It's actually the opposite. They're finding more ways to deplatform and censor and debank us because it makes it really difficult to do this. I mean, if you were writing about leftist ideologies, you'd be on the front page of New York Times. You'd be making $300,000 a year. You'd have a million people following you on Twitter. But it's
Yeah. Oh
you're
yeah,
the inverse of that.
Between YouTube and Twitter and a couple other platforms, I've lost over 200,000 followers there from
Yeah.
being deplatformed. They don't like me very much. So yeah, and then I also have a bookshop. I did publish the one book on the global landscape on vaccine ID passports, but on my bigger reports, people asked me if I could start formatting them into PDF documents so that they could download them and archive them or print them and share them. And so those are in there as well.
So, folks, this wraps up the end of this first show. Keep an eye out for the second episode of this, where we're going to be diving into space, the new frontier for the central control grid. So, if you want more wonderful things to think about while you're falling asleep, make sure you tune in for the next episode.